The red dust rose in lazy spirals behind the stagecoach wheels, hanging in the still air like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison pressed her handkerchief to her nose, though after 3 days on the trail, the gesture had become more habit than help. Through the coach's small window, she watched the landscape roll by endless stretches of sagebrush and mesquite, broken only by distant mesas that shimmered in the afternoon heat. She was 22, though the mirror at the last way station had shown her a face already touched by the journey's hardships. Her green traveling dress, once the height of Boston fashion, now bore the permanent mark of frontier dust. Everything about her spoke of the East, from the careful way she held her gloved hands to the pearl buttons that marched up her bodice in perfect formation. The coach lurched to a stop so suddenly that Sarah's carpetbag tumbled from the opposite bench. Through the window, she saw the driver climbing down, his movements stiff from hours on the box. "Clearwater Station," he called out, his voice rough as the gravel under his boots. "End of the line for you, miss." Sarah's heart hammered against her corset stays. This wasn't supposed to be the end. Fort Worth was still 200 miles south. But she knew better than to argue. Her father's letters had been clear about the arrangements. She gathered her bags, her movements careful and deliberate, as if she could somehow delay the inevitable by taking her time. The driver helped her down, his calloused hand engulfing hers for a brief moment before he turned back to his duties. The station was nothing more than a collection of weathered boards that someone had seen fit to call a building. A corral held a dozen horses, their coats dusty and their heads low in the heat. Beyond that, the land stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by a line of cottonwoods that marked some distant creek. "Miss Morrison." The voice came from behind her, low and measured. Sarah turned to find a man standing in the shadow of the station's overhang. He was perhaps 30, though the sun had carved lines around his eyes that made precise age impossible to determine. Everything about him spoke of the frontier, from his worn leather chaps to the Colt .45 that rode low on his hip. "Yes," she managed, proud that her voice didn't shake. "I am Miss Morrison." He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that might have been courtesy or might have been habit. "Name's Jake Thornton. I'm to take you the rest of the way." Sarah had expected someone older, someone more respectable. This man looked like he'd grown from the very dust of the territory, all sharp angles and weathered surfaces. His shirt had been white once, she supposed, though now it carried the permanent stain of hard living. When he moved to collect her bags, she noticed the easy grace of someone who spent more time in the saddle than on foot. "My father wrote that I would be met by representatives of Mr. Dalton," she said, using the formal tone that had served her well in Boston society. "That's right." Jake hefted her trunk as if it weighed nothing. "Coleman Dalton hired me to see you safe to his ranch. 3 days' ride, if the weather holds." 3 days, alone with this stranger. Sarah swallowed hard, thinking of her father's grand promises about her future as the wife of a prosperous cattle baron. She'd never met Coleman Dalton, knew him only through her father's glowing descriptions and the single photograph he'd sent a stern-faced man in his 40s, standing before a grand house that seemed impossibly out of place in this wilderness. Jake had already loaded her belongings onto a pack horse. Now he stood beside 2 saddled mounts, waiting. When Sarah didn't move immediately, he spoke again. "You do ride, don't you?" "Of course." The lie came easily. She'd ridden in Boston side saddle, in carefully controlled circles around manicured parks, but she sensed that admitting her limitations to this man would be showing weakness, and some instinct warned her against that. He studied her for a long moment, those dark eyes taking in her traveling dress, her delicate boots, the way she held herself like she was still in some Eastern drawing room. Then he moved to the smaller of the 2 horses, a bay mare with a gentle eye. "This is Buttercup," he said, running a hand along the horse's neck. "She's steady. Won't give you trouble." Sarah approached carefully, aware of his watchful gaze. The horse was smaller than those she'd known in Boston. Stockier, built for endurance rather than show. When Jake offered his cupped hands to help her mount, she had no choice but to accept, trying not to think about the impropriety of his touch, even through her gloves and boots. The saddle was different too, a Western design that felt foreign and precarious. She gripped the horn with both hands, her back rigid with the effort of staying upright. Jake swung onto his own mount with an ease that made her feel even more out of place. His horse was a rangy black gelding that looked like he could run for days without tiring. Everything about the pair of them, man and horse, seemed carved from the same hard stone as the landscape itself. "We'll take it slow at first," he said, and she couldn't tell if the words were meant as comfort or condescension. "Long way to go." They rode in silence for the first hour, the horse's hooves raising small clouds of dust that hung in their wake. Sarah concentrated on staying in the saddle, on matching the rhythm of the horse's gait, on not showing the growing ache in muscles she'd never known she possessed. The sun tracked across the sky, relentless and unforgiving. Jake rode slightly ahead, his posture relaxed but alert, occasionally glancing back to check on her progress. He didn't speak, and Sarah found herself grateful for the silence. Words would have required energy she needed for the simple act of staying mounted. The landscape began to change as they traveled, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills studded with juniper and pinon pine. In the distance, mountains rose like blue shadows, their peaks still touched with snow despite the heat of the valley floor. When Jake finally called a halt beside a small spring, Sarah nearly wept with relief. Her legs trembled as he helped her dismount, and she had to grip his arm to keep from falling. If he noticed her weakness, he gave no sign, simply turning to tend the horses while she found a relatively smooth rock to sit on. "Drink," he said, offering her a canteen. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but she'd never been more grateful for anything in her life. While the horses drank from the spring, Jake produced a cloth-wrapped bundle from his saddlebags. Inside were strips of dried beef, hard biscuits, and a handful of dried apples. He divided the meager fare between them, then settled on his haunches a careful distance away. "You're not what I expected," Sarah found herself saying, then immediately wished she could call the words back. He looked up from beneath his hat brim. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone older, perhaps, more refined." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Coleman Dalton doesn't hire men for their refinement. Miss, he hires them to get the job done." "And your job is to deliver me like a package." The smile vanished. "That's right." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. She'd spoken without thinking, letting her fear and discomfort sharpen her tongue. But before she could form an apology, Jake was on his feet, already moving toward the horses. "We need to make Turkey Creek by nightfall," he said. "Best mount up." The afternoon wore on in a blur of heat and dust and the endless rhythm of the horses' gaits. Sarah's world narrowed to the space between her horse's ears, to the broad line of Jake's back ahead of her, to the simple goal of staying in the saddle for one more mile, one more minute. She'd thought herself prepared for this new life. Her father had painted it in grand strokes, the adventure of the frontier, the security of marriage to a successful man, the chance to be part of something larger than the confined world of Boston society. But riding through this vast emptiness, following a stranger toward a future with another stranger, Sarah felt the full weight of what she'd agreed to. Know what had been agreed for her. The distinction mattered, though it changed nothing. The sun was painting the western sky in shades of amber and rose when Jake finally turned off the main trail. They followed a narrow track through a grove of cottonwoods, the sound of water growing stronger with each step. Turkey Creek appeared like a miracle, a ribbon of clear water running over smooth stones, sheltered by trees whose leaves whispered in the evening breeze. "We'll camp here," Jake announced, dismounting with his usual fluid grace. Sarah managed to slide from her saddle without falling, though her legs nearly buckled when they took her weight. Every muscle from her waist down screamed in protest. She stood perfectly still, willing her body to remember how to function, while Jake efficiently set about making camp. She watched him work, noting the economy of his movements, the way he seemed to anticipate what was needed before the need arose. In minutes, he had the horses unsaddled and hobbled, a fire ring constructed from creek stones, and her bags arranged to create a small private space beneath one of the larger trees. "There's a pool upstream a ways," he said without looking at her. "If you want to wash up, I'll stay here. Get supper started." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, the first sign of kindness he'd shown all day. She gathered her necessaries and followed the creek until she found the pool, a natural basin where the water collected, deep enough to bathe if one were desperate enough. And she was desperate. 3 days in the stagecoach, followed by today's ride, had left her feeling like she'd been rolled in flour and baked. She stripped down to her chemise, not daring to remove more despite Jake's assurance of privacy, and waded into the water. The cold shocked her system, driving away the fog of exhaustion. She scrubbed at her face and arms, unpinned her hair, and tried to rinse the dust from it. For a few precious moments, she felt almost human again. By the time she returned to camp, properly dressed, though still damp around the edges, Jake had coffee boiling and something that smelled surprisingly good cooking in a cast-iron pan. He glanced up as she approached, and something flickered in his eyes' surprise, perhaps at seeing her with her hair down, still darkened by water. "Beans and salt pork," he said, gesturing to the pan. "Not fancy, but it'll fill you up." They ate in companionable silence, the fire crackling between them as darkness settled over the land. Sarah found herself stealing glances at him across the flames, trying to reconcile this man with the task he'd been hired to perform. There was something in the way he moved, the way he constantly scanned their surroundings even while seeming relaxed, that spoke of years living on the edge of danger. "You should sleep," he said finally, banking the fire. "Long day tomorrow." Sarah looked at the bedroll he'd laid out for her, then at the vast darkness beyond their small circle of light. Where will you sleep?" "I'll be around." He settled his back against a tree trunk, rifle across his knees. "Get some rest. Miss Morrison, you're safe." "Safe." The word hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than it should. Sarah crawled into the bedroll fully clothed, her body grateful for any horizontal surface. Above, stars emerged in numbers she'd never imagined possible, the Milky Way painting a bright river across the sky. She thought of Boston, of the life she'd left behind, of her father, whose business failures had led to this arrangement, of Coleman Dalton, waiting at the end of this journey to claim the bride he'd bought with promises of financial salvation for the Morrison family. And she thought of Jake Thornton, sitting vigilant in the darkness, a man hired to deliver her like so much freight. There was a story there. She sensed something in those watchful eyes that spoke of losses and hard choices. But it wasn't her place to wonder. In 3 days, he would hand her over to Coleman Dalton and ride away, his job complete. Sarah closed her eyes, willing sleep to come. Tomorrow would bring another day in the saddle, another day closer to her destination, another day following this silent man through a landscape that seemed determined to strip away everything she'd thought she knew about herself. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was the sound of Jake stirring the fire, the soft scrape of wood against stone, a strange comfort in the vast western night. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of horses snorting in the cool morning air. For a moment, she couldn't place where she was, then the ache in every muscle brought yesterday flooding back. She lay still, watching through slitted eyes as Jake moved around the camp with the same quiet efficiency she'd observed the night before. He'd already saddled both horses and packed most of their gear. Now he crouched by the fire, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. In the early light, she could see him more clearly than she had yesterday. His face was all angles and planes, weathered but not unkind. A scar ran along his jaw, pale against his sun-darkened skin. His hands, wrapped around the coffee pot, were scarred too, the hands of someone who'd lived by rope and leather and gun. "I know you're awake," he said without turning around. Sarah sat up, embarrassed to be caught watching. "Good morning." He brought her a cup of coffee, black and strong enough to strip paint. "Morning. There's biscuits and cold bacon if you're hungry. We need to be riding within the hour." She took the cup gratefully, wrapping both hands around its warmth. The morning was surprisingly cold, their breath visible in small puffs. Jake had already returned to his tasks, checking the horse's hooves, adjusting saddle straps, every movement deliberate and practiced. "You don't talk much," Sarah observed, then immediately wished she hadn't. It sounded like criticism, though she hadn't meant it that way. Jake paused in his work, glancing at her over his shoulder. "Not much to say. How long have you been doing this guiding people? I mean..." "Long enough." She waited, but he offered nothing more. After a moment, he returned to the horses, the conversation clearly over. Sarah sipped her coffee and wondered at this man who seemed to have built walls as vast as the territory itself. The second day's ride was worse than the first. Sarah's body, already sore from yesterday, protested every movement. She bit her lip to keep from crying out as she mounted Buttercup, determined not to show weakness. Jake watched her struggle but said nothing, simply turning his black gelding southward once she was settled. They rode through country that grew progressively wilder. The trail, such as it was, wound through stands of juniper and across ridges that offered views of endless valleys below. Twice they had to dismount and lead the horses down slopes too steep to ride. Jake went first each time, testing the footing, then waited below to catch Buttercup's reins if needed. He never touched Sarah herself, always maintaining a careful distance. But she noticed how he positioned himself always where he could steady her if she stumbled, always between her and any potential danger. It was protection offered without acknowledgement, like everything else about him. The sun climbed higher, beating down with an intensity that made her traveling dress feel like a wool blanket. Sweat trickled between her shoulder blades, and her corset seemed to tighten with each breath. Jake rode ahead, apparently immune to the heat, his posture never changing. Around midday, they stopped at a seep spring tucked beneath an overhang of red rock. Jake helped her dismount those scarred hands, gentle despite their strength, then immediately moved away, giving her space. Sarah found shade against the rock wall and tried not to think about how much farther they had to go. "Here," Jake said, appearing beside her with a wet bandana. "For your neck. Helps with the heat." She took it gratefully, pressing the cool cloth against her skin. "Thank you." He settled nearby, not quite beside her, but close enough for conversation if she wanted it. For a while, they sat in silence, listening to the horses drink and the buzz of insects in the sage. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah finally said. Jake tilted his hat back, those dark eyes finding hers. "You can ask." "Why did Mr. Dalton hire you specifically? There must be other guides." Something shifted in his expression, there and gone too quickly to read. "Coleman Dalton and I have history. He knows I'll get the job done." "What kind of history?" This time the silence stretched longer. Jake pulled a piece of grass and twisted it between his fingers, his gaze fixed on some distant point, the kind better left buried. There was a finality to his tone that told Sarah the subject was closed. She wondered what could create such careful distance between men who clearly still did business together. But Jake was already standing, ready to move on. The afternoon brought them through a narrow canyon where the walls rose on either side like prison bars. Jake's vigilance increased noticeably here, his hand never far from his gun, his head constantly moving as he scanned the rim above. Sarah found herself holding her breath, infected by his tension. "Raiders sometimes use this canyon," he said, the most he'd volunteered all day. "Apache, mostly, but sometimes worse. Worse than Apache. White men who've forgotten how to be men." His voice carried a hardness she hadn't heard before. At least the Apache have reasons for what they do. They cleared the canyon without incident, but Jake's mood remained dark. He pushed the horses harder than before, clearly wanting distance from those confining walls. Sarah clung to her saddle horn and endured, sensing this wasn't the time for questions or complaints. As the sun began its descent, they climbed a long ridge that seemed to go on forever. Sarah's world narrowed to Buttercup's rhythmic steps and the effort of staying upright. She didn't realize she was swaying until Jake's voice cut through her exhaustion. "Miss Morrison." He'd pulled up beside her, close enough to catch her if she fell. "We're almost to tonight's camp. Can you make it?" Pride wanted her to say yes, but honesty won. "I don't know." Without a word, he dismounted and came to stand beside Buttercup. "Come on down, we'll walk the rest." Her legs barely held when she slid from the saddle. Jake steadied her with one hand, then stepped back, maintaining that careful distance. They walked side by side, leading the horses, and somehow the solid ground beneath her feet made everything more bearable. "You're doing better than I expected," he said quietly. Sarah managed a weak smile. "Liar." That surprised a short laugh from him, the first genuine emotion she'd seen him display. "Maybe, but you haven't complained once. Most Eastern women would be wailing by now. Most Eastern women have better sense than to agree to this." "Then why did you—" The question hung between them as they crested the ridge. Sarah didn't answer immediately, taking in the view that spread before them, a valley painted in shades of gold and purple, with a ribbon of green marking another creek at its heart. "I didn't have a choice," she finally said. "My father's debts. Mr. Dalton offered a solution, marriage in exchange for financial rescue." Jake's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. They descended toward the creek in silence, the only sounds the creak of leather and the horses' breathing. Their second camp was much like the first, a sheltered spot near water, with good grass for the horses and clear sight lines in all directions. Jake worked with the same quiet efficiency, and soon they had a fire going and coffee brewing. Sarah tried to help, but her fumbling attempts seemed to cause more work than assistance. "Sit," Jake finally told her, not unkindly. "Rest while you can." She obeyed, watching him work. There was something almost peaceful about his movements, as if these simple tasks, gathering wood, tending fire, caring for horses, were a form of prayer. "You never answered my question," she said as he handed her a plate of beans and salt pork. "About why you agreed to this job." Jake settled across the fire from her, his own plate balanced on his knee. "Money," he said simply. "Same as everyone." "I don't believe you." His eyes found hers across the flames. "Doesn't matter what you believe. Miss, in 2 days, you'll be Coleman Dalton's problem, not mine." The words stung more than they should have. Sarah looked down at her plate, appetite gone. "Of course, forgive me for forgetting my place." "That's not—" Jake started, then stopped. He set his plate aside and rubbed a hand over his face. "You don't have a place. That's the problem. You're not cargo, but you're not available. You're spoken for by a man who paid me good money to make sure you arrive intact." "Intact," Sarah repeated, the word bitter in her mouth. "Like a piece of furniture." "Like a woman under protection," Jake corrected. "There's a difference." They finished their meal in silence, the fire popping and settling between them. Sarah helped clean up this time, ignoring Jake's protests, needing something to do with her hands. As full darkness fell, she found herself reluctant to retreat to her bedroll. The night was beautiful, stars emerging in brilliant abundance, and despite everything, she wasn't ready to be alone with her thoughts. "Tell me about the stars," she said impulsively. "They're different here than in Boston." Jake looked up, seeming to consider. Then he pointed to the horizon. "That bright one's Venus, always rises first, and there," his finger traced a pattern. "That's the hunter, Orion. Those 3 stars are his belt." For the next hour, He named constellations and told their stories, not the Greek myths she knew, but other tales. Apache legends, Mexican folklore, stories cowboys told around campfires. His voice lost its usual terseness, warming to the subject. "How do you know all this?" Sarah asked. "Man spends enough nights under open sky. He either learns the stars or goes crazy from the emptiness." Jake's expression was thoughtful in the firelight. "Stars are company that don't ask questions or make demands." "Is that what you prefer, company that doesn't ask questions?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah felt the weight of that gaze. Sometimes questions lead places better left unvisited. Miss Morrison. "Sarah," she said softly. "My name is Sarah." "I know your name." He stood abruptly, reaching for his rifle. "You should sleep. Tomorrow will be harder than today." She wanted to ask why tomorrow would be harder. Why he kept such careful distance. Why his eyes sometimes held shadows darker than the night itself. But he was already moving to his position against the tree, setting himself between her and the darkness beyond their camp. Sarah crawled into her bedroll, her body grateful for horizontal rest despite the hard ground. She watched Jake's silhouette against the stars, wondered what kept him so vigilant, what made him choose this life of endless trails and careful distances. "Jake," she called softly. "Thank you for the stars." He didn't answer, but she thought she saw him nod. Sarah closed her eyes, listening to the creek's murmur and the distant howl of coyotes. 2 more days, he'd said. 2 more days until she became Coleman Dalton's property in all but name. She tried to picture her future husband, tried to feel something other than dread at the prospect. But all she could see was Jake's profile against the stars. All she could think about were scarred hands and careful distances, and the way he'd laughed when she called him a liar. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, she dreamed of endless trails and a man who knew the names of stars but wouldn't share his own story. The 3rd night came with a cold that cut through Sarah's traveling dress like a blade. She woke shivering in the pre-dawn darkness, her breath clouding in the frigid air. The fire had died to embers, and frost sparkled on the grass like scattered diamonds. Jake was already up, rebuilding the fire with quiet movements. When he saw her stirring, he brought over his own coat a heavy duster that smelled of leather and smoke and something uniquely him. "Here," he said, draping it over her shoulders. "Desert gets cold at night this time of year." Sarah pulled the coat closer, grateful for its warmth. "What about you?" "I'm used to it." He fed larger sticks to the growing flames. "Coffee will help." She watched him work, noting how he never seemed affected by the conditions that left her miserable. His shirt sleeves were rolled up despite the cold, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked by old scars. Everything about him spoke of a life lived without comfort, without softness. "We'll reach Antelope Springs by midday," he said, handing her a cup of coffee. "Last stop before Dalton's ranch." Sarah's stomach clenched at the reminder. 1 more day. After tomorrow, she would be Coleman Dalton's intended, living in his house, preparing to become his wife. The thought made the coffee taste bitter. They broke camp as the eastern sky began to lighten, painting the clouds in shades of rose and gold. Sarah tried to return Jake's coat, but he waved her off. "Keep it for now. Sun won't warm things up for a few hours yet." She mounted Buttercup with muscles that protested less than before, her body adapting to the demands of the trail. The coat hung nearly to her ankles, making her feel small and protected in a way that had nothing to do with the garment itself. They rode in companionable silence through the early hours, watching the land come alive with the morning light. A jackrabbit bounded across their path, and a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, hunting for unwary prey. The desert, which had seemed so barren at first, revealed itself to be full of life if one knew how to look. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, surprising herself with the admission. Jake glanced at her, something softening in his expression. "Most people don't see it. They look at all this—" He gestured at the vast expanse. and see nothing but emptiness. What do you see? He considered the question, his gaze sweeping across the landscape. Freedom, space to breathe, room to be who you are without anybody telling you different. Is that why you stay out here for the freedom? Part of it. His voice carried weight. Also stays out here because town life doesn't suit men like me. Sarah wanted to ask what he meant by men like me, but something in his tone warned against it. They rode on, the sun climbing higher, slowly warming the air. Near midday, Jake suddenly pulled up, his hand moving to his rifle. Sarah's heart jumped as she followed his gaze to a dust cloud on the horizon. "What is it?" she whispered. "Riders, 3, maybe 4. His voice was calm but alert. "Coming this way." Sarah felt ice in her veins despite the warming day. "Indians?" "No, Indians wouldn't raise that much dust." Jake studied the approaching cloud with narrowed eyes. "Stay close to me. Don't speak unless I tell you to." They waited, tension stretching between them like a wire. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, loud in the desert silence. Jake sat his horse with deceptive ease, but she noticed how he'd shifted his coat back, clearing access to his sidearm. The riders emerged from their dust cloud 3 men, rough-looking even by frontier standards. Their clothes were trail-worn and dirty, their faces shaded by hat brims but clearly unfriendly. They spread out as they approached, a move that made Jake's hand drift closer to his gun. "Well, well," the lead rider said, pulling up 20 feet away. "Jake Thornton, heard you were back in the territory." "McGraw." Jake's voice was flat as stone. "You're a long way from Tucson." The man called McGraw grinned, revealing teeth stained by tobacco. "Business brings us all over. Speaking of which, that's a mighty fine-looking woman you got there. Don't usually see quality like that on the trail." Sarah felt their eyes on her like dirty hands. She pulled Jake's coat tighter, trying to shrink into its protection. Jake shifted his horse slightly, putting himself more squarely between her and the men. "The lady's none of your concern," Jake said quietly. "Now that's unfriendly." McGraw leaned forward in his saddle. "Here we are. Old acquaintances meeting on the trail. And you don't want to introduce us proper." "We're not acquaintances, McGraw. We just happened to survive the same war." "That we did. Though you always did think you were better than the rest of us." McGraw's eyes glittered with old resentment. "Too good to ride with your own kind after Appomattox." "My kind didn't rob stages and shoot unarmed men," Jake replied evenly. The temperature seemed to drop despite the sun overhead. One of McGraw's companions, a thin man with nervous eyes, shifted in his saddle. "Tom, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Henley." McGraw never took his eyes off Jake. "I'm curious. What's the great Jake Thornton doing playing nursemaid to a pretty Eastern girl unless—" His grin widened. "This wouldn't be Coleman Dalton's new bride. Would it hurt he ordered one from back east?" Jake's stillness was more frightening than any threat. "You heard wrong." "Don't think so. See, Dalton's got enemies. A lot of people wouldn't mind seeing him taken down a peg. Man who'd pay good money to make sure his mail-order bride never arrives might be real grateful." Sarah couldn't breathe. She understood the danger. The careful way Jake had been watching the horizon. The weight of the responsibility he carried. These men would take her, use her as a weapon against Coleman Dalton, and she would be lucky if that was all they did. "A last warning, McGraw." Jake's voice was soft as death. "Ride on." McGraw laughed. 3 against 1, I like those odds." "Your funeral." Everything happened at once. McGraw went for his gun, but Jake had already drawn. The crack of his Colt split the air, and McGraw tumbled backward off his horse. The thin man, Henley, threw up his hands in surrender, but the third rider was bringing his rifle around. Jake fired again, the bullet catching the rifleman in the shoulder, spinning him out of his saddle. Through it all, Jake never moved from his position shielding Sarah, never showed a moment's panic or haste. "Don't Henley screamed as Jake's gun swung toward him. I ain't drawing! Then get your friends and ride, Jake said, his voice unchanged. Tell anyone else with ideas about the lady that Jake Thornton's escorting her. They want to try their luck. They know where to find me. Henley scrambled to help his wounded companions. McGraw was dead. Jake's first shot had been perfect, but the rifleman was groaning, clutching his bleeding shoulder. It took all 3 horses to get them moving. Henley leading the extra mount with McGraw's body draped across the saddle. Jake didn't holster his gun until they were specks in the distance. Then he turned to Sarah, and she saw the concern crack his careful composure. You hurt? She shook her head, not trusting her voice. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the reins. Sarah, he said her name gently, reaching out to steady Buttercup as the mare danced nervously. It's over. You're safe. You killed him. The words came out as a whisper, just like that. He would have killed me, and then done worse to you. Jake's eyes were dark with truth she didn't want to know. This isn't Boston. Sarah, out here, you protect what's yours or lose it. I'm not yours. The protest was automatic, weak. No, he agreed. But you're under my protection until I deliver you to Dalton. That makes you my responsibility. They resumed riding in heavy silence. Sarah couldn't stop seeing at the speed of Jake's draw, the cold precision of his shots, the way death had come and gone like a passing cloud. This was the Jake Thornton that Coleman Dalton had hired. She realized, not just a guide, but a killer when needed. How many men have you killed? She asked, then immediately wished she hadn't. Jake rode for so long without answering that she thought he would ignore the question. Finally, he spoke, his voice distant. First one was at Shiloh, Yankee boy no older than 16. After that, he shrugged. You stop counting, start forgetting their faces. That's when you know you've lost something you can't get back. Do you regret it? Regret's a luxury I can't afford. He glanced at her. But yeah, sometimes, when I'm fool enough to think about it. They reached Antelope Springs as the sun peaked overhead, a small oasis in the desert with a few cottonwoods shading a natural spring. Jake watered the horses while Sarah found privacy to collect herself. Her hands had stopped shaking, but the morning's violence had left her feeling fragile, aware of how thin the line was between safety and disaster. When she returned, Jake had laid out a meal on a flat rock, the same simple fare as always. But somehow it looked like a feast. He handed her a cup of water from the spring, cold and sweet. Tomorrow this time, you'll be at Dalton's ranch, he said. Hot bath, real bed, proper food. Will you stay at least for a night? Something flickered across his face. No, my job's done when I deliver you safe. I'll resupply and head back. Back to what? He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Next job. Always another person needs to get somewhere. Another package to deliver. Is that all I am to you, a package? The question hung between them like the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. Jake looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the walls he'd built, the careful distance he maintained, the weight of whatever had brought him to this life. You're Coleman Dalton's future wife, he said finally. Anything else you might be, that's not for me to say. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Exhaustion, she told herself. The stress of the morning's encounter, nothing to do with the man sitting across from her, close enough to touch but distant as the mountains on the horizon. Thank you, she said softly, for protecting me, for everything. Jake nodded, already turning away. Just doing my job, Miss Morrison? Miss Morrison. Back to formality, back to distance. Sarah understood the message. Tomorrow she would be another man's problem, another man's wife. Today's violence. This fragile connection forged on the trail, none of it mattered against the simple fact of Coleman Dalton's claim. They mounted up as the afternoon heat began to build, riding toward the final night on the trail. Sarah wore Jake's coat despite the warmth, unwilling to give up its protection just yet. Tomorrow it would be returned, along with any foolish notions she might have developed about the man who'd lent it to her. But for today, for these last precious hours, she allowed herself the comfort of its weight, the lingering scent of leather and gunpowder and the man who'd killed to keep her safe. Tomorrow would bring whatever tomorrow brought. Today, she was still just Sarah, riding through the desert with a man who knew the names of stars. The sun had already begun its descent when they encountered the second group of riders. Unlike McGraw's bunch, these men wore badges of sheriff's posse from the look of them. 5 men with tired horses and grim faces. "Hold up there," the lead rider called out, raising a hand in greeting rather than threat. He was an older man with a silver threading through his mustache. "Jake Thornton, that you?" "Sheriff Watson." Jake's posture relaxed slightly, though Sarah noticed his hand remained within easy reach of his gun. "Long way from Prescott." "Tracking some boys who robbed a stage 2 days back. Heard shots earlier that your handiwork. McGraw and 2 others tried to take something that wasn't theirs," Jake said simply. Watson spat tobacco juice to the side. "McGraw's dead." "Unless he learned to survive a bullet through the heart." "Well, that saves the territory the cost of a trial." Watson's eyes moved to Sarah, taking in her Eastern clothes and Jake's protective positioning. "Ma'am, sorry you had to witness such unpleasantness." Sarah managed a nod, still processing how casually these men discussed death. Watson studied her a moment longer, then looked back to Jake. "This wouldn't be the Boston lady Dalton's been expecting." "That's not your business, Sheriff." "Maybe not, but keeping her safe is—" Word's gotten around about Dalton's mail-order bride. There's folks who'd pay good money to see she doesn't arrive." "They're welcome to try," Jake said flatly. Watson chuckled. "I imagine they are, with you escorting her. Still, might want to take the old Apache trail instead of the main road. Less chance of meeting unwanted company." "Already planned on it." The sheriff touched his hat brim to Sarah. "Ma'am, you're in good hands with Thornton here. Man's worth a dozen in a fight, and his word's better than gold. When he says he'll get you somewhere safe, you can bet your life on it." "Apparently I am," Sarah said, finding her voice. That earned her another chuckle from Watson. "God spirit, this one, Dalton's a lucky man." He gathered his reins. "We'll be moving on. Those stage robbers won't catch themselves. Jake, watch yourself. McGraw had friends." "Always do." The posse rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving Jake and Sarah alone again on the trail. They continued in silence until Jake suddenly turned off the main path, guiding them into rougher country. "The Apache Trail?" Sarah asked. "Safer than it sounds. Apache haven't used it in years, but most folks still avoid it out of habit." He glanced back at her. "Means a harder ride, but less chance of meeting anyone else with ideas." The trail was indeed harder, narrow, and rocky, winding through stands of manzanita and scrub oak. They had to dismount several times to lead the horses through particularly treacherous sections. Sarah's dress caught on thorns and branches, tearing in several places, but she pressed on without complaint. As darkness approached, Jake led them to a sheltered canyon with high walls and only one way in or out. A small spring fed a pool surrounded by grass, clearly a regular stopping place for those who knew of it. "Last night on the trail," Jake said as he helped her dismount. "Tomorrow afternoon, you'll be at Dalton's ranch." Sarah stood beside Buttercup, reluctant to let go of the saddle. Once she did, once she stepped away from the horses and the trail, it would truly be ending. This strange journey, this unexpected connection to a man she barely knew, all of it would be over. They went through their evening routine, Jake tending the horses and setting up camp while Sarah washed the trail dust from her face and hands. But tonight felt different. There was a weight to each small action, a finality that made her chest tight. Dinner was the usual fare. But Jake had added something extra, a small bottle of whiskey produced from his saddlebags. "Medicinal purposes," he said with a slight smile, pouring a small amount into her coffee. "You've earned it." The whiskey burned, but it also warmed, spreading heat through her chest and easing the knot of tension she'd carried all day. They sat by the fire, the canyon walls rising around them like protective arms. "Tell me about him," Sarah said suddenly. "Coleman Dalton? You know him better than anyone else I've met." Jake stared into the fire for a long moment. "What do you want to know?" "Is he kind?" "He's fair, pays his men on time, doesn't ask more than a man can give, but kind." Jake shook his head. "Coleman Dalton didn't build his empire by being kind. Will he be good to me?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Jake took a sip from his own cup before answering. "He'll provide for you, keep you safe, give you a place in society. That's what you agreed to, isn't it?" "That's what my father agreed to," Sarah corrected softly. "Same result." "Is it?" She looked at him across the fire. "Is safety and provision all a woman should expect from marriage?" "I wouldn't know. Never been married." "Why not?" Jake smiled, but it was bitter. "What woman would have a man like me? No home but the trail, no family but my horse, no future but the next job. I've got nothing to offer but a quick draw and knowledge of the stars." "Some women might find that enough," Sarah said quietly. Their eyes met across the fire, and something passed between them, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of what could never be. Jake looked away first, standing abruptly. "I need to check the perimeter," he said, grabbing his rifle. "Jake, wait." Sarah stood too, her heart pounding. "I need to say something." He paused but didn't turn around. "These past 3 days? I know I was just a job to you, but you've shown me more kindness, more genuine care than anyone has in a long time. Whatever happens tomorrow, I wanted you to know that." Jake's shoulders tensed. When he finally turned, his expression was carefully controlled. "You don't know me, Sarah. You don't know the things I've done, the man I really am. I know you've protected me. I know you've treated me with respect when you could have taken advantage. I know you see beauty in this harsh land and stories in the stars. That's enough." "Is it?" He stepped closer, and suddenly the space between them felt charged with possibility. "Is it enough when tomorrow you'll belong to another man, when after tonight we'll never see each other again?" Sarah's breath caught. "I don't belong to anyone yet?" The words hung between them like a challenge. Jake's control visibly wavered, something raw flickering in his eyes. Then, with visible effort, he stepped back. "Get some rest," he said roughly. "Long day tomorrow." He disappeared into the darkness beyond the firelight, leaving Sarah alone with her tumultuous thoughts. She prepared for bed mechanically, her mind spinning. Tomorrow she would meet Coleman Dalton. Tomorrow her new life would begin. But tonight she was still free, still herself, still able to make choices. And as she lay in her bedroll looking up at the stars Jake had named for her, a dangerous idea began to take shape. She waited until the fire had died to embers, until Jake's breathing from his position against a nearby rock had steadied into the rhythm of sleep. Then, moving carefully, she slipped from her bedroll and approached him. "Jake," she whispered. He came awake instantly, hand moving to his gun before recognizing her. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. She took a breath, gathering courage. "I have a proposition." Even in the darkness, she could see his wariness. "What kind of proposition?" "Tomorrow I become Coleman Dalton's property. A business transaction, bought and paid for, but tonight I still belong to myself. And I choose." Her voice trembled. "I choose to give what's mine to give, not to the man who bought me, but to the man who's earned it." Jake went very still. "Sarah, you don't know what you're saying." "Don't I?" She moved closer, close enough to see his face in the moonlight. 3 days ago, I was prepared to give everything to a stranger for my father's debts. Now I want to give something freely, by my own choice, to a man who's shown me more consideration than I ever expected. Is that so wrong? Yes, he said harshly. It's wrong because you're not mine to take. Because tomorrow I'll be Coleman Dalton's, she interrupted. But tonight, I'm asking you not as the man hired to deliver me, but as Jake Thornton, will you give me this one night where I'm not a debt to be paid or a package to be delivered, but just a woman who chooses you? Jake closed his eyes, and she could see the war playing out across his features. When he opened them again, the carefully maintained distance had cracked. You're asking me to betray a man who trusts me, he said quietly, to take something that's not mine. I'm asking you to accept what I freely offer, Sarah corrected, to give me one memory of choice before a lifetime of obligation. For a long moment, they stood frozen in the moonlight. Then Jake reached out, his fingers barely brushing her cheek. If I say yes, he whispered, it changes everything. You understand that there's no going back. I understand, Sarah breathed. That's why I'm asking. Jake's hand dropped from her cheek as if burned. He stood abruptly, putting distance between them, his breathing uneven in the quiet night. You don't know what you're asking, he said, his voice rough with barely controlled emotion. You're scared about tomorrow, not thinking clear. Don't tell me what I'm thinking, Sarah said, hurt flashing through her. I've had 3 days to think about nothing else. 3 days. Jake laughed bitterly. 3 days, and you think you know enough to throw away your future. What future? Sarah's voice rose despite herself. The future where I'm sold like cattle to pay my father's debts, where I share a bed with a man I've never met because he paid for the privilege. The future where you have a home, security, respect. Jake countered. Dalton's not a bad man. Sarah, he'll treat you well. I don't want to be treated well, Sarah said fiercely. I want to be wanted. I want one night where I'm chosen, not bought. Jake turned away, running his hand through his hair in frustration. And tomorrow? What happens tomorrow when I deliver you to Dalton knowing what we've done, when I take his money with one hand after betraying him with the other? The pain in his voice made Sarah's resolve waver. She hadn't considered what this would cost him, not just the money, but his honor, his reputation, the code he lived by. I'm sorry, she whispered. I wasn't thinking about, I just wanted. I know what you wanted. Jake's voice gentled. And God help me, I want it too. You think it's been easy, these 3 days watching you struggle and adapt. Seeing your strength, your grace, you think I haven't imagined. He stopped himself, shaking his head. What? Sarah prompted softly. What have you imagined? Jake was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, meant for the desert night and her alone. I imagined a different life, one where I met you in some town somewhere, where I could court you proper, take you to church socials, Sunday picnics, where I could offer you something more than a bedroll on hard ground and coffee bitter enough to strip paint. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Foolish dreams for a man like me. Why foolish? Because I am what I am. Sarah, a hired gun, a drifter. I've got blood on my hands that won't wash clean and ghosts that follow me every mile. You deserve better than that. You deserve better than one night with a man who can't give you tomorrow. Sarah moved closer, drawn by the raw honesty in his voice. What if one night is all I want? What if I'd rather have one night of choosing than a lifetime of being chosen? You say that now, Jake said quietly, but come morning, you'll hate me for it, and you'll hate yourself more. No, Sarah said firmly. Whatever happens, I won't hate you. How could I hate the only person who's seen me as more than currency? Jake finally turned to face her, and in the moonlight she could see the war still raging in his eyes. Dalton hired me because he trusts me. In 5 years of working for him, I've never betrayed that trust. Is it betrayal if I was never his to begin with? Sarah asked. He paid my father, not me. I never agreed to anything. That's not how the world works, and you know it. Then maybe it's time the world changed. They stood facing each other, the space between them electric with possibility and impossibility in equal measure. Sarah could see Jake weakening, see the careful control cracking. Please, she whispered. I'm not asking for promises or tomorrows. I'm asking for tonight, for one choice that's truly mine. Jake closed his eyes, and when he opened them, she saw surrender there. But instead of reaching for her, he stepped back. No, he said, the word final as a slammed door. I won't be the man who ruins you. Sarah, I won't be another regret you carry. You're not. I am. His voice was firm now. The moment of weakness passed. You think you're choosing, but you're just running, and I won't be your escape route. The rejection stung worse than any physical blow. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, humiliation flooding through her. She'd offered herself, thrown away every lesson about propriety and virtue, and he'd refused. I see, she managed through a tight throat. Forgive me for misunderstanding. I thought, but clearly I was wrong. She turned to go back to her bedroll, but Jake caught her arm gently. You weren't wrong, he said softly, about wanting it. You weren't wrong about that, but wanting isn't enough. Sarah, not when the cost is this high. The cost to your reputation? You mean your relationship with Dalton? No, Jake said firmly. The cost to you, your future, your life with him. My life with him is already ruined, Sarah said bitterly. How can I share his bed knowing I wanted yours first? Jake's grip on her arm tightened briefly, then released. You'll forget. Time has a way of fading things. You'll build a life with him, have children, make a home, and someday you'll be grateful I said no tonight. Don't tell me what I'll feel, Sarah snapped, pulling away. You don't know me well enough for that. Maybe not, Jake conceded. But I know myself, and I know I'd rather live with wanting you than with having destroyed you. Sarah stared at him, seeing the resolution in his stance, the finality in his expression. He'd made his choice, and nothing she could say would change it. You're a coward, she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Something flashed in Jake's eyes, hurt, maybe, or anger. Maybe I am, but at least I'm an honorable coward. Honor, Sarah laughed bitterly. What good is honor when it leaves everyone miserable? It's all some of us have, Jake said quietly. It's all that separates us from men like McGraw. Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to rage against his stubborn nobility, but the fight went out of her as quickly as it had come. He was right, in his way. Tomorrow she would be Coleman Dalton's, and this moment of madness would pass. It had to. I should rest, she said dully. As you said, long day tomorrow. Jake nodded, watching her with eyes that held too much understanding. Sarah. Don't, she held up a hand. Just don't. You've made your position clear. She returned to her bedroll, wrapping herself in the blanket as if it could shield her from her own humiliation. Behind her, she heard Jake settle back into his guard position, heard the familiar sound of him checking his rifle. Sleep wouldn't come. She lay staring at the stars, replaying the conversation, cringing at her boldness. What had she been thinking that 3 days on the trail had created something more than proximity? That a few shared moments meant anything against the weight of obligation and honor? The night stretched endlessly. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled, its cry lonely and wild. Sarah understood the feeling. Tomorrow she would enter her cage, however gilded it might be, and Jake would ride away, back to his freedom, his stars, his carefully maintained distances. She must have dozed eventually, because she woke to the smell of coffee and the first light of dawn painting the canyon walls. Jake was already packed, moving with his usual efficiency but avoiding her eyes. "Morning," he said neutrally, handing her a cup. "Morning," she replied, matching his tone. They broke camp in near silence. The easy companionship of previous mornings replaced by awkward formality. Sarah mourned the loss even as she understood its necessity. They'd stepped too close to a line that couldn't be crossed, and now they were paying the price in distance. The final day's ride seemed both endless and too short. They descended from the rough country, the trail widening and showing more signs of use. By midday, they could see smoke rising from distant chimneys, and Sarah's stomach tightened with each mile. "That's it?" Jake said finally, pointing to a collection of buildings nestled in a valley. "Dalton Ranch." It was impressive, she had to admit. A main house of adobe and timber, larger than anything she'd seen since leaving the East. Barns, corrals, bunkhouses all spoke of prosperity and permanence. This would be her home, her future, her life. "It's bigger than I expected," she managed. "Dalton's done well for himself. Started with nothing, built all this through will and determination." Jake's voice was carefully neutral. "You'll want for nothing there." "Nothing except choice," Sarah said before she could stop herself. Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. They rode on in silence, each hoofbeat bringing her closer to her fate. As they approached the ranch proper, men began to take notice. Cowboys stopped their work to stare, and Sarah was acutely aware of her torn dress, her trail-worn appearance. She sat straighter, trying to summon some remnant of Eastern dignity. A man emerged from the main house, tall, broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair and a face that matched the photograph she'd seen. Coleman Dalton, her future husband. He strode toward them with the confidence of a man who owned everything in sight. His eyes went to Sarah first, assessing, approving, then shifted to Jake. "Thornton, right on time, as always." "Oh, Mr. Dalton." Jake dismounted smoothly. "Delivery as requested." The words stung, reducing her to cargo again. But what else had she expected? This was business. Completed satisfactorily. Dalton approached Sarah's horse, offering his hand to help her down. His grip was firm, possessive, and she forced herself not to compare it to Jake's careful touch. "Miss Morrison, welcome to your new home. I trust the journey wasn't too difficult." "Mr. Thornton took excellent care of me," Sarah said, proud that her voice remained steady. "I'm sure he did. Man's reliable as sunrise." Dalton's arm settled around her waist, proprietary and unmovable. "Come, let's get you inside. You'll want to wash and rest before dinner." Sarah allowed herself to be led away, but at the last moment, she looked back. Jake stood by his horse, already preparing to leave. Their eyes met across the yard, and in that glance was everything they couldn't say regret. Longing, the weight of choices made and unmade. Then Dalton guided her through the door, and Jake Thornton disappeared from view. Her new life had begun, built on obligation rather than affection, duty rather than desire, and somewhere out on the trail, a man who knew the names of stars would carry the memory of 3 days when anything had seemed possible. The door closed behind her with the finality of a prison cell, and Sarah Morrison began the process of becoming Mrs. Coleman Dalton, a transformation that would require burying the part of her that had awakened under desert stars, in the care of a man who'd chosen honor over happiness. The bathwater had long since turned cold, but Sarah remained submerged, staring at the adobe walls of her new quarters. Coleman Dalton had given her a tour of the house, her house now. He'd reminded her showing off imported furniture and modern conveniences with the pride of a man displaying trophies. A knock at the door interrupted her brooding. "Miss Morrison, Mr. Dalton requests your presence for dinner." "Thank you. I'll be down shortly." Sarah forced herself from the bath, dressing in one of the gowns that had been laid out for her silk and lace. Far finer than anything she'd owned in Boston. Dalton had thought of everything, down to her measurements. The efficiency of it chilled her. The dining room was grand, with a table that could seat 20 and a chandelier that caught the last rays of sunset. Dalton rose as she entered, pulling out her chair with practiced gallantry. "You look lovely," he said, appraising her like a man examining a new horse. "The blue suits you." "Thank you." Sarah took her seat, trying not to think about eating beans by firelight, about coffee shared in comfortable silence. Dalton poured wine imported from California. He informed her and raised his glass. "To new beginnings." Sarah touched her glass to his, the crystal ringing like a funeral bell. New beginnings. The meal was elaborate roasted beef, vegetables she hadn't seen since leaving Boston, bread that was actually soft after days of trail fare. It should have been heaven. Instead, each bite felt like sawdust. "I trust Thornton treated you well," Dalton said, cutting into his beef with precise movements. "Man's peculiar, but reliable." Peculiar. Keeps to himself. Never stays in one place long. I've offered him permanent work more than once, better pay. Comfortable quarters. He always refuses. Dalton shook his head. "Some men aren't meant for civilization, I suppose." He was professional. Sarah managed. "Very protective." "Good. That's what I pay him for." Dalton studied her across the table. "You're quieter than I expected. Your father's letters painted you as quite spirited." "It's been a long journey." "Of course. You'll feel more yourself after a good night's rest." He smiled, but it didn't warm his gray eyes. "Tomorrow we'll discuss wedding arrangements. I thought next month would give you time to settle in, order whatever you need from San Francisco." "A month." Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her wine. "That's very thoughtful." "I'm a thoughtful man." "Sarah, you'll find I run my household like my business efficiently, fairly, follow the rules, and we'll get along splendidly." "And if I don't follow the rules?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Dalton's expression hardened slightly, then smoothed back into paternal indulgence. "But why wouldn't you? I'm offering you everything a woman could want: security, comfort, status. Surely that's worth a little compliance." Sarah thought of Jake's words wanting isn't enough and understood them better now. Dalton offered everything except what mattered most, the freedom to choose. After dinner, Dalton walked her to her room, stopping at the door with an expectation that made her skin crawl. But he merely took her hand, pressing dry lips to her knuckles. "Sleep well, my dear. Tomorrow begins your new life properly." Sarah closed the door and leaned against it, fighting the urge to run. Run where? Back to Boston and disgrace into the desert to die of exposure. There was nowhere to go, no escape from the bargain that had been struck. She moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, Jake was making camp. Was he thinking of her, or had he already relegated their 3 days to memory? Another job completed. The stars began to emerge, and Sarah found herself searching for the ones he'd named. Their Venus, rising first as always. And the hunter, with his belt of 3 stars. She pressed her hand to the cool glass, remembering another hand teaching her the sky. The next days passed in a blur of wedding preparations and household lessons. Dalton's housekeeper, Mrs. Hernandez, showed her the running of things which merchants to use, how to manage the servants, the social expectations of a rancher's wife. "Say, mister, Dalton likes dinner at 6 sharp." The older woman explained, "Never later. And he takes his coffee black, no sugar." Like Jake, Sarah thought, then pushed the comparison away. She had to stop doing that, measuring everything against 3 days that meant nothing. Dalton himself was attentive but distant, treating their engagement like a business merger. He gave her expensive gifts, a pearl necklace, a thoroughbred mare, A music box from Paris, but never asked what she might actually want. "You're too generous," she said when he presented her with yet another trinket. "Nonsense. My wife should have the finest—" He paused, studying her. "You've been melancholy. Are you homesick?"
"A little."
Sarah lied. She wasn't homesick for Boston. She was homesick for the feeling of being seen, truly seen, by someone who expected nothing from her. That will pass. Once we're married, once you have children to occupy you, you'll forget all about the East. Children. The thought made her stomach turn. How could she bear this man's children when her treacherous heart kept remembering another man's refusal? A week into her residence, Sarah was in the garden when a commotion arose from the direction of the bunkhouse. Cowboys were gathering, voices raised in excitement or alarm. "What is it?" she asked Mrs. Hernandez, who'd appeared at her elbow. "Trouble with rustlers. Most likely, Mr. Dalton will handle it." Sarah watched as Dalton emerged from his office, strapping on a gun belt she'd never seen him wear. He looked older, trying to appear dangerous. Less natural than... She cut off the thought, but followed as the crowd moved toward the ranch entrance. A rider was approaching fast, horse lathered with sweat. "Boss," the rider called out. "Found Hendricks and his boys trying to cut out 50 head from the south pasture. They shot Williams when we tried to stop them."
"How bad?"
Dalton demanded. "Bad enough. Doc's with him now." Dalton turned to his foreman. "Get 10 men, armed. We're going after them." "Coleman," Sarah said without thinking. "Perhaps you should contact the sheriff." "The sheriff's 2 days away." Dalton cut her off. "By then they'll be in Mexico with my cattle. No, we handle this ourselves." "But if men are already hurt—" "Sarah," his tone was sharp, final. "This is men's business. Go back to the house." The dismissal stung, but what stung more was the memory of another man who'd included her in decisions, who'd explained situations rather than ordering her away. Sarah watched Dalton rally his men, saw their nervous energy, their eagerness to prove themselves. "They're not fighters," she said quietly to Mrs. Hernandez. "They're cowboys." "Mr. Dalton knows what he's doing," the housekeeper replied, but Sarah heard doubt in her voice. The posse thundered out, leaving dust and worried wives behind. Sarah returned to the house but couldn't settle. She kept thinking about Hendricks. She'd heard the name before. Where? Then it came to her. McGraw had mentioned Hendricks, one of the men with grudges against Dalton, which meant this wasn't random rustling. This was targeted, planned, and Dalton was riding straight into it with cowboys who'd never faced real violence. She paced her room as darkness fell, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The stars emerged one by one, and she found herself at the window again, looking north toward the trail she'd traveled. "You were right," she whispered to the night. "Wanting isn't enough." Near midnight, horses returned fewer than had left. Sarah flew downstairs to find chaos in the courtyard. Men wounded, horses blown, and Dalton was being carried by 2 cowboys, his shirt dark with blood. They bore him inside, shouting for water, bandages, someone to ride for the doctor. "What happened?" Sarah demanded, pushing through the crowd. "Ambush," one cowboy gasped. "They were waiting. Knew we were coming somehow." Sarah helped as best she could, tearing petticoats for bandages, heating water, trying to stem the flow of blood from the bullet wound in Dalton's shoulder. He was conscious but pale, jaw clenched against the pain. "The cattle," he ground out. "Gone, boss, along with Hendricks and his bunch." Dalton cursed, then caught sight of Sarah. "You shouldn't see this." "Hush," she said, pressing cloth against the wound. "Save your strength." The doctor arrived near dawn, exhausted from the hard ride. He worked in grim silence, finally pronouncing that Dalton would live if infection didn't set in. "He's lucky," the doctor said, washing bloody hands. Inch lower and it would have caught the lung. Lucky. Sarah sat beside Dalton's bed, watching him sleep fitfully, and wondered at the word. Was any of this luck or just the inevitable result of choices made and chances taken? Should have listened. Dalton mumbled, startling her. What? His eyes opened, fever bright. You said, get the sheriff. Should have listened.
Rest now,
Sarah soothed, but he gripped her hand with surprising strength. Thornton would have known, he said, words slurring. Would have seen the trap. Man's got instincts I don't. Jake's name hit her like cold water.
Why didn't you send for him?
Pride. Dalton laughed bitterly, then winced.
Wanted to handle it myself. Show you. Show everyone. I'm not just a businessman playing cowboy.
Coleman, I know what they say. He continued, lost in fever and confession. That I bought you because no woman would have me freely. That I'm trying to be something I'm not. Maybe they're right. Sarah didn't know what to say. This vulnerable side of Dalton human, flawed. Trying too hard was somehow worse than his usual controlling demeanor. It made him real, made her upcoming marriage real in a way it hadn't been before. She sat with him through the night, cooling his fever, listening to his rambling. He talked of building his empire, of loneliness, of wanting something he couldn't quite name. By dawn, the fever had broken and he slept peacefully. Sarah stepped onto the porch, exhausted and conflicted. The attack had shown her truth she hadn't wanted to see. Dalton was just a man, trying to build a life the only way he knew how. He wasn't cruel, just limited in his view of what a wife should be, what a marriage could be. And she was trapped, as surely as if bars surrounded her, trapped by obligation, by her father's debts, by the lack of any alternative. The wild idea of escape that had flickered that night by the campfire seemed childish now. The fantasy of a girl who'd thought 3 days could change a lifetime of expectations. Miss Morrison. She turned to find Dalton's foreman, hat in hand.
Yes.
Boss is asking for you. Seems urgent. Sarah returned to find Dalton awake, propped against pillows. His color was better, but his expression was grave.
Sarah, I need you to do something for me.
Of course. What is it? I need you to send for Thornton. Sarah's hand trembled as she held the pen. The letter to Jake lay before her. Dalton's instructions clear. Come at once. Hendricks still at large. Need your gun. Add whatever you think necessary to convince him, Dalton said from his bed, voice weak but determined. He respects you. He'll come if you ask.
Coleman, I don't think... Please, Sarah.
His gray eyes held something she'd never seen before fear.
I've lost 3 men. Williams died this morning. I can't protect you, can't protect the ranch. Flat on my back like this, I need someone I can trust.
Sarah sealed the letter, her heart heavy with the irony. Dalton was asking her to summon the one man she desperately wanted to see and desperately needed to avoid. The messenger rode out within the hour. Jake could be anywhere within a week's radius, but the network of cowboys and traders would find him. They always did. 3 days passed in anxious waiting. Dalton's wound showed signs of infection despite the doctor's care, and Sarah found herself genuinely worried. Whatever else he was, Coleman Dalton didn't deserve to die for the crime of trying to protect what was his. She was changing his bandages when horses approached, several of them, moving fast. Sarah's heart leaped, then sank. It could be Jake, or it could be Hendricks returning to finish what he'd started.
Sarah.
Dalton gripped her wrist. My gun, top drawer of the desk. She fetched the Colt, checking the loads as Jake had taught her during their journey. Strange how those little lessons stayed with her. How to check a gun, read the weather, find water in dry country. Boot steps on the porch, heavy and measured. Sarah raised the gun, standing between Dalton and the door. If Hendricks thought to find easy prey, The door opened, and Jake Thornton stood there, taking in the scene with those dark eyes that missed nothing. His gaze went from the gun in her hands to Dalton in the bed, and something flickered across his face too quickly to read. "You can lower the gun, Sarah," he said quietly. "It's just me." Sarah's knees went weak with relief and something else, something dangerous. She set the gun aside, not trusting her voice. Jake approached the bed, studying Dalton with a professional eye. "You look like hell, Coleman." "Feel worse." Dalton managed a weak smile. "Thanks for coming." "Your letter said Hendricks. How many men?" 8, maybe 10. They got 50 head and killed Williams. Shot 2 others before we even knew what hit us." Jake's expression darkened. "You went after them yourself." "What else was I supposed to do? Let them rob me blind?" "You were supposed to think." Jake's voice carried an edge. "Hendricks has been planning this for months. You played right into his hands." "I know that now," Dalton admitted. "That's why I need you. Find them. Jake, bring back what's mine." "The cattle or Hendricks?" "Both, if possible. But mostly I want this finished. I can't have Sarah living in fear, looking over her shoulder every time she steps outside." Jake's eyes found hers across the room, and Sarah felt that same electric connection from their night in the canyon. 3 weeks had changed nothing. If anything, the pull was stronger for having been denied. "I'll need men," Jake said, turning back to Dalton. "Your cowboys aren't fighters. Take whoever you need. Hire more if necessary. Money's no object. I work alone." "Not this time." Dalton's voice firmed despite his weakness. "This is war, Jake. You can't take 8 men by yourself." "Watch me." "Jake," Sarah spoke without meaning to, drawing both men's attention. "Please, don't go alone. If something happened to you because of us—" She trailed off, realizing how much she'd revealed. Dalton's eyes narrowed slightly, looking between them with new interest. "Sarah's right," he said slowly. "Take at least a few men, for her peace of mind, if nothing else." Jake's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I'll take Morrison and Santos. They've got sand. The rest would just get in the way." "When will you leave?" "Now. Trail's already cold. Longer we wait, harder it'll be to track them." "Jake," Dalton called as he turned to go. "Be careful. Hendricks isn't McGraw. He's smarter, meaner. He won't hesitate to kill you." "Neither will I," Jake said simply, and left. Sarah followed him onto the porch. Unable to help herself, he was already calling orders to the men, organizing supplies with his usual efficiency. "Jake." He paused but didn't turn. "You should go back inside. I wanted to thank you for coming." "Don't thank me yet." He finally faced her, and the careful distance was back in place. How is he really? Worried, scared, more human than I've ever seen him. Bullet wounds have a way of doing that. Jake studied her, taking in the exhaustion, the worry. "You look tired." "I've been nursing him. Mrs. Hernandez helps, but he prefers." She shrugged. "He prefers me there." "Of course he does. You're his—" The words stung, but they were true. She was Dalton's not wife yet, but claimed nonetheless. Jake's presence didn't change that, only made it harder to bear. "How have you been?" she asked softly. "These 3 weeks?" "Working, moving, same as always." But something in his eyes said differently. "You." "Learning to be a rancher's wife, it's an adjustment." "You'll manage. You're stronger than you think." "Am I?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "I don't feel strong. I feel trapped." Jake stepped closer, then caught himself. Don't do this, Sarah. Not now." "I'm not doing anything. I missed you. Is that so wrong?" "Yes," he said harshly. "It's wrong because nothing's changed. You're still his. I'm still hired help.
And wanting what we can't have still leads nowhere good. Morrison appeared, leading saddled horses. We're ready when you are. Jake. Be right there. Jake looked back at Sarah, his expression softening slightly. Take care of him. Whatever else he is, he doesn't deserve to die in his bed while his enemies run free. And you, who takes care of you? Same as always. Me. He touched his hat brim, the gesture formal and final. Ma'am. He was mounted and gone before she could respond, Santos and Morrison flanking him. Sarah watched until they disappeared into the heat shimmer, then returned to Dalton's bedside. Interesting, Dalton said, eyes too knowing. Very interesting. What is... you and Thornton? Something happened on the trail. Nothing happened. The truth of it made her voice bitter. Mister, Thornton was a perfect gentleman. I'm sure he was. Jake's nothing if not honorable. Dalton shifted, wincing at the movement. But you wanted something to happen. Heat flooded Sarah's face. Coleman, I don't think... It's all right, he interrupted. I'm not blind. Sarah, nor am I fool enough to think a woman like you would choose a man like me if she had options. But you don't have options, do you? Your father made sure of that. I don't understand what you're saying. I'm saying I know this isn't the marriage either of us dreamed of. You wanted love. I imagine some romantic notion of a man who'd court you properly, win your heart. He smiled sadly. Instead, you got a business transaction. Coleman, let me finish. I may not be the man you choose, but I am the man you have, and I'll do right by you. Sarah, you'll never want for anything. Except freedom, she said before she could stop herself. Freedom. Dalton considered the word. Is that what Thornton represents to you, freedom? I don't know what you mean. I think you do. His eyes were sharp despite the fever. But let me tell you something about Jake Thornton. He is free. Yes, free as a wolf. And just as alone, he'll never settle, never build anything lasting. The trail is in his blood, and nothing, not even a woman like you, will change that. You don't know that. Don't I? 5 years I've known him. Offered him everything, land, position, a home. He turns it down every time. You know why? Sarah shook her head. Because staying means choosing, means saying, this is who I am, this is what I want. And Jake Thornton has been running from that choice since the war ended. Maybe longer. Or maybe he just hasn't found anything worth staying for, Sarah countered. Maybe. Dalton closed his eyes, exhaustion taking over. Or maybe he's smart enough to know that wanting and having are two different things. One brings dreams, the other brings responsibility. Sarah sat in silence, listening to his labored breathing. Outside, the ranch continued its daily rhythm, cowboys working, horses neighing, life moving forward regardless of the dramas inside. But her thoughts were with 3 riders heading into danger, one in particular who carried her heart whether he wanted it or not. The next days passed in tense waiting. Dalton's fever broke, but he remained weak, dependent on Sarah for everything. She tended him dutifully, trying not to think about Jake facing 8 killers with only 2 cowboys for backup. On the 3rd night, she was dozing in the chair beside Dalton's bed when gunfire erupted in the distance. She jerked awake, heart pounding. More shots, closer now, and the thunder of hooves. My gun, Dalton said urgently. Sarah handed him the Colt, then went to the window. In the courtyard below, cowboys were scrambling for cover as riders burst through the gate. Muzzle flashes in the darkness, shouts and screams, chaos. Get down, Dalton ordered. But Sarah was already moving, grabbing the rifle from beside the door. You can barely sit up, she said. Someone needs to... The door burst open. Sarah swung the rifle around, finger on the trigger, then nearly sobbed with relief. Jake stood there, hat gone, shirt torn and bloody. "Are you hurt?" she asked, dropping the rifle to reach for him. "Not my blood." He moved past her to Dalton. "Hendricks is dead. So are most of his men. Few got away, but they won't be back." "The cattle? Scattered? Your boys can round them up come morning." Jake swayed slightly, and Sarah saw the exhaustion beneath the competence. "Sit," she ordered. "You're dead on your feet." "I'm fine." "Sit down, Jake," Dalton said quietly. "That's an order." Jake dropped into a chair, and in the lamplight Sarah could see the cost of the fight. His knuckles were split. A graze along his ribs showed through his torn shirt, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who'd added more ghosts to his collection. "Morrison," Dalton asked. "Took a bullet in the leg. He'll live. Santos is seeing to him." "And you took on 8 men with 1 wounded partner." Dalton shook his head. "You're either the bravest man I know or the most foolish." "Neither, just good at what I do." Jake's eyes found Sarah's, and I had promises to keep. The weight of those words hung in the air. Dalton looked between them again, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I see," he said quietly. "Well, you've kept your promise. Hendricks is dead. My cattle recovered. My fiancé safe. As always. Jake, I'm in your debt. Just pay me what we agreed. I'll be gone at first light." "Stay," Sarah said impulsively. "You're exhausted, possibly hurt. At least rest a few days." "Sarah." Dalton's voice was gentle but firm. "Mister, Thornton knows his own mind. If he says he needs to go, we should respect that." The dismissal was polite but clear. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. She was doing it again, forgetting her place, her promises, the reality of her situation. Jake stood to leave, but Dalton raised a hand. "Wait, there's something else we need to discuss. Both of you." Sarah felt her stomach drop. The look in Dalton's eyes was too knowing, too calculated. He'd seen through their careful distance, their studied indifference. "I'm not a fool," Dalton continued, his voice steady despite his weakness. "I see what's between you two. Have since you walked in that door. Jake." "Coleman," Jake started, but Dalton cut him off. "Let me speak. I'm lying here with a hole in my shoulder, dependent on others for the first time in my life. It gives a man perspective." He shifted, grimacing. "I bought Sarah, paid her father's debts for the right to marry her. Thought I was getting a wife, maybe even building something like love eventually." "You are," Sarah said quickly. "Coleman, I've agreed to marry you. I'll honor that." "Honor?" Dalton laughed bitterly. "Yes, you would. You're that kind of woman. You'd spend your life honoring an agreement, doing your duty, all while your heart belongs to another man." "That's not—" "Don't lie to me. Sarah. Not now." His voice was gentle but firm. "And you, Jake, ready to ride out at dawn? Run back to your trails rather than fight for what you want. Both of you so damn noble, so ready to sacrifice happiness for honor." Jake's jaw was tight, his hands clenched. "What do you want from us?" "Coleman, I want the truth. For once in this whole mess, I want honesty." Dalton looked between them. "Sarah, do you love him?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Sarah felt both men watching her, waiting. The truth clawed at her throat, demanding release. "Yes," she whispered, then stronger. "Yes, I love him." Jake made a sound, pain or pleasure. She couldn't tell. Dalton nodded as if she'd confirmed something he already knew. "And you, Jake, don't bother denying it. I've seen you face down 8 armed men without flinching, but put you in the same room with her, and you look like you're being tortured." Jake was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "Doesn't matter what I feel. She's yours. Bought and paid for, like you said." "Is she?" Dalton studied him. Tell me something. Jake, in all the years you've worked for me, have you ever asked for anything, ever called in a debt or claimed a favor? No. Then I'm asking you now, as a man who owes you his life several times over, what do you want? If you could have anything, what would it be? Jake's eyes found Sarah's across the room. The walls he'd built, the careful distance he'd maintained, all of it crumbled in that look. Her, he said simply. I want her, but she's not mine to want. Perhaps not. Dalton agreed. But she's mine to give. Both Sarah and Jake stared at him. Dalton managed a weak smile at their shock. What kind of marriage would we have? Sarah, you doing your duty while dreaming of another man, me knowing I'm second choice, always wondering if you're thinking of him when you look at me. He shook his head. I've built my empire on knowing when to cut my losses. Coleman, Sarah said, tears pricking her eyes. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do. For all our sakes. He looked at Jake. I'm releasing her from our agreement. Her father's debts remain paid. That was always more about helping an old friend than acquiring a wife. Sarah is free to choose her own path. I can't let you do that, Jake said. The scandal. What scandal? My bride-to-be discovered she couldn't adapt to ranch life. It happens. She'll return east, and I'll continue as I have for 40 years alone, but not lonely. Dalton's smile was sad but genuine. Maybe it's time I stopped trying to buy what can't be purchased. Sarah moved to his bedside, taking his hand. You're a good man, Coleman Dalton. Better than you know. Good enough to want you to be happy, even if it's not with me. He squeezed her hand, then looked at Jake. Take her, tonight, before I come to my senses. Take her somewhere I can't find you. Somewhere you can stop running and start living. Coleman, go, Dalton said firmly. Before the laudanum wears off and I remember all the reasons this is foolish. Jake crossed the room in 3 strides, catching Sarah's hand. You're sure? He asked her. Once we leave, there's no coming back. No comfortable house, no security, no certainty except what we make ourselves. I've had 3 weeks of comfort and security, Sarah said. It nearly killed me. I'd rather have uncertainty with you than all the guarantees in the world with someone else. Jake's control finally broke. He pulled her against him, holding her as if she might disappear. Sarah breathed him in leather and gunpowder and desert wind and felt like she was coming home. Go, Dalton said again, his voice tired. Take the bay mare wedding present. And Jake, there's a pouch in my desk. Payment for the Hendricks job, plus a bonus. Call it a wedding gift from an old fool who finally learned the difference between having and holding. Jake released Sarah long enough to retrieve the pouch. He paused at Dalton's bedside, struggling for words. Thank you, he said finally, for everything. For this most of all. Take care of her, Dalton replied, or I'll hire someone meaner than you to hunt you down. You won't need to. Sarah kissed Dalton's forehead gently. Be well, Coleman. Find someone who can love you the way you deserve. Perhaps I'll just build a bigger empire. Seems simpler. His eyes were closing, exhaustion and emotion taking their toll. Go on now. Dawn comes early, and you'll want distance before the hands start talking. They left him there, propped against his pillows, a king releasing subjects he'd never truly ruled. Sarah gathered a few belongings, practical things, trail clothes she'd kept from her journey. Everything else belonged to a life she was leaving behind. Jake waited in the courtyard with 2 saddled horses. The bay mare Dalton had mentioned stood beside his black gelding, already packed for travel. Where will we go? Sarah asked as he helped her mount. Wherever you want. California, Oregon Territory, maybe Montana. Somewhere we can start fresh. Be whoever we choose to be. Together. Together. He swung onto his horse with the fluid grace she remembered. No more packages to deliver. No more people to protect except each other. Think you can handle that? I've handled you for 3 days. How much harder can a lifetime be? Jake laughed, the sound free and genuine, in a way she'd never heard before. They rode out together as the eastern sky began to lighten, leaving behind certainty for possibility, comfort for adventure, safety for love. Behind them, Coleman Dalton's ranch settled into sleep, its owner dreaming perhaps of what might have been or what still could be. Ahead stretched miles of open country, dangerous and beautiful, and theirs for the taking. "Jake," Sarah said as they cleared the ranch boundaries. "That night in the canyon, when I asked you to, when you refused." "One of the hardest things I've ever done," he admitted. "Also the rightest." "Why?" "Because you deserved better than stolen moments. You deserved a choice, free and clear, not clouded by desperation or circumstance." He reached over, taking her hand. "You deserve to be wanted for yourself, not as escape or rebellion." "And now? Now you've chosen, eyes open, price known, path clear. That makes all the difference." They rode in comfortable silence as the sun rose, painting the desert in shades of gold and rose. Sarah thought about the letter she'd write to her father, explaining her choice. He wouldn't understand, might never forgive her for throwing away security for love. But she'd learned something in these weeks, that security without freedom was just another kind of prison. "No regrets?" Jake asked, reading her mood with the uncanny perception she was coming to expect. "None. You? Only one." "What's that?" He grinned, looking younger than she'd ever seen him. "That I can't see Dalton's face when he realizes I took his best horse along with his bride." Sarah laughed, the sound carrying across the desert like a promise. Somewhere behind them, a life of comfort and predictability waited for someone else to claim. Ahead lay uncertainty, hardship, and the constant challenge of the frontier. She spurred the bay mare forward, eager to meet it all. They stopped at midday by a stream Jake knew, watering the horses and sharing a simple meal. Everything felt different now, charged with possibility rather than weighted by impossibility. "We'll need to be married," Jake said practically. "First town we hit with a preacher, make it legal and proper." "Is that a proposal, Mr. Thornton?" "Reckon it is. Not much of one, though. No ring, no knee-bending, no pretty words." "I've had pretty words and promises of rings. I prefer honest intentions." "Then, honestly, Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, I intend to love you till my last breath. I intend to keep you safe as I can in this wild country, to give you whatever home I can build, to never take for granted the gift Coleman Dalton gave us both. Will that do?" "It will do perfectly." He kissed her then, there by the stream with the horses as witnesses and the sky as their chapel. It was everything their night in the canyon could have been, free of guilt, rich with promise, sweet with the knowledge that this was choosing, not taking. When they finally pulled apart, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "Long road ahead?" "I know. Might be rough going sometimes." "I expect so." "But we'll ride it together." "Together," Sarah agreed, and the word felt like a vow. They mounted up as the afternoon heat began to build, turning their horses toward whatever future they could carve from this unforgiving land. Sarah looked back once, seeing the dust of their passage already settling, erasing their tracks. Ahead, Jake rode tall in his saddle, scanning the horizon with the watchful eyes of a man who'd learned to guard what was precious. He'd lost his lonely freedom but gained something worth the trade: a partner, a purpose, a reason to finally stop running. And Sarah, she'd traded security for uncertainty, comfort for adventure, a known future for an unwritten one. As she followed Jake into the vastness of the territory, she knew she'd made the right choice. Some things, after all, were worth more than safety. Love was one of them. Freedom was another. And finding both in the same man, that was worth any price the frontier could exact. The sun tracked across the sky as they rode,
and Sarah found herself remembering that first night on the trail, when Jake had taught her the names of stars. Now she understood why he'd learned them. They were constants in a changing world, fixed points by which to navigate. She had her own fixed point now, riding ahead of her with easy grace. Whatever came, wherever they went, she would follow that star and trust it to guide her home. 2 weeks had passed since they'd left Dalton's ranch. 2 weeks of hard riding, sleeping under stars, living on trail food and each other's company. They'd avoided towns, skirting settlements, wanting distance before they surfaced into the world again. Now they sat their horses on a rise overlooking the town of Cedar Ridge, a sprawling settlement that straddled the border between Arizona and New Mexico territories. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the distant sound of hammering suggested growth, prosperity, civilization. Big enough to disappear in, Jake observed. Small enough to build something real. Sarah studied the town, trying to imagine a life there. You really think we can just stop, become regular people? Don't see why not. I've got money saved, plus what Coleman gave us, enough to start something ranch maybe, or a freight business. You could teach school if you wanted. Or be your wife, Sarah finished. That would be enough. Jake, more than enough. He reached over, taking her hand. We'll do it right. Find a preacher first thing, make it legal, then figure out the rest. They rode down into Cedar Ridge as the afternoon sun slanted across the main street. The town was busier than expected freight wagons. Cowboys, families doing their shopping. No one paid particular attention to another travel-worn couple arriving from the desert. Jake secured rooms at the Frontier Hotel, 2 rooms, he specified firmly, until they were properly married. The clerk, a thin man with knowing eyes, smirked but said nothing. Preacher, Jake asked. Reverend Morrison at the White Church, end of Main Street, though if you're in a hurry. Judge Carter performs ceremonies too, less particular about the details. If you follow. Jake's eyes hardened slightly. We'll do this proper. The Reverend's still there this time of day. Should be. Prayer meetings not till evening. They walked to the church. Sarah, acutely aware of her trail-worn appearance. She'd imagined her wedding day many times, but never like this, dusty, exhausted, wearing men's trousers under a torn riding skirt. Reverend Morrison proved to be a kindly older man with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He took in their obvious affection, their equally obvious haste, and drew his own conclusions. Marriage is a sacred covenant, he said carefully, not to be entered into lightly or under duress. No duress, Jake said firmly. Just 2 people who've chosen each other and want God's blessing on it. I see. And you, miss, you're entering this freely. More freely than anything I've ever done, Sarah answered. The Reverend studied them a moment longer, then nodded. Very well. I'll need witnesses. My wife can serve as one. And he looked around. Ah, William, perfect timing. A young man had entered, carrying a load of firewood. He set it down, dusting his hands. William helps with maintenance, the Reverend explained. William, these folks need a witness for their wedding. Would you mind? Happy to help, William said, grinning. Always liked seeing folks happy. The ceremony was simple. Words Sarah barely heard over the pounding of her heart. Jake produced a plain gold band from his pocket. When had he gotten that, and slipped it onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly. I now pronounce you man and wife, Reverend Morrison concluded. You may kiss your bride. Jake drew her close, the kiss soft and reverent, a promise made before God and witnesses. When they pulled apart, Sarah saw her own joy reflected in his eyes. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. The Reverend paused, realizing he'd never asked their names. Thornton, Jake supplied. Jake and Sarah Thornton. Sarah Thornton. The name felt right. Felt real in a way nothing had since leaving Boston. They signed the register, paid the reverend, and walked back into the afternoon sunlight as husband and wife. "Hotel?" Jake asked, and there was a new heat in his eyes that made Sarah's breath catch. "Hotel," she agreed. But as they crossed Main Street, a familiar voice made them both freeze. Jake Thornton." They turned to find Sheriff Watson from Prescott, the man who'd warned them about McGraw weeks ago. He stood outside the sheriff's office, badge glinting in the sun, studying them with professional interest. "Sheriff," Jake said carefully. "Long way from Prescott. Could say the same about you, and with Coleman Dalton's missing bride, no less." Watson's eyes went to Sarah's left hand, noting the wedding band. "Though I guess she's not his anymore." Jake stepped slightly in front of Sarah, hand drifting toward his gun. "Is there a problem?" "Sheriff." Watson held up both hands. "Easy, son. No problem for me. Got a wire from Dalton 2 days ago. Said Miss Morrison had reconsidered the arrangement and left with his blessing. Also said anyone causing trouble for the newlyweds would answer to him personally." Sarah felt relief wash through her. Even now, Coleman was protecting them. "Newlyweds," Watson repeated with a slight smile. "That was fast work, Thornton." "When you know, you know," Jake replied simply. "Indeed." Watson tipped his hat to Sarah. "Congratulations, Mrs. Thornton. You've got yourself a good man. Bit rough around the edges maybe, but solid where it counts." "Thank you. Sheriff, I know exactly what I've got." Watson moved on, but the encounter had shifted something. Jake's posture remained tense as they continued to the hotel. "He could make trouble," Sarah said quietly. "He could, but he won't. Watson's straight as they come. If he says we're clear, we're clear." Jake paused at the hotel entrance. "But it's a reminder. The past has a way of catching up, even when you think you've outrun it." "Are you having second thoughts?" "Never." He cupped her face gently. "Just want you to know what you've signed on for. Life with me won't be easy. Sarah, there'll always be someone who remembers. Someone with a grudge or a debt." "I know. I choose it anyway. Choose you anyway." They climbed the stairs to their room, one room now, the clerk's smirk even more pronounced. Jake locked the door behind them, and suddenly the air felt charged with possibility. "I've imagined this," he said softly. "Every night since that canyon. Imagined having the right to touch you, to—" He stopped, color rising in his face. "I'm no good with words." "Then don't use words," Sarah whispered. What followed was worth the wait, worth the denial, worth every moment of thinking it could never be. Jake was gentle, reverent, treating her like something precious and breakable until she showed him she was neither. They came together with desperate tenderness, making up for lost time and stolen chances. Later, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor, they lay entwined, Sarah tracing the scars that marked Jake's chest. "Will you tell me," she asked, "about these about before?" "Someday," he promised. "When the telling won't bring the pain back fresh. Right now. I just want to be here, in this moment, with my wife." "Your wife," Sarah repeated, marveling at the words. "I like how that sounds." "So do I." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "Never thought I'd say it, mean it. Never thought I'd have this." "What changed?" "You," he said simply. "You changed everything." They dozed, woke to make love again as evening painted the room in deeper shadows. Finally, hunger drove them from their nest. Sarah dressed in the best of her travel-worn clothes, wishing she had something prettier for her wedding night. "You're beautiful," Jake said, reading her thoughts. "Always have been. Dressed in silk or trail dust, doesn't matter." They found a small restaurant off Main Street, quiet and clean. Over beef and potatoes, they made plans tentative, hopeful things about the future they were building. "There's land north of here," Jake said. "Good water, decent grass.
We could start small, build up a herd over time. You want a ranch? I want to try. Want something that's ours, that we're building together. He smiled ruefully. Though I don't know the first thing about being settled, you might have to teach me. We'll learn together, Sarah promised. They were walking back to the hotel when it happened. A man stepped from an alley, young, nervous, holding a gun that shook in his grip. Jake Thornton, he said, voice cracking. You killed my brother. Jake went still, hand hovering near his weapon. Easy, son. What brother would that be? Tom McGraw. Shot him down 3 weeks ago. Sarah's blood ran cold. McGraw, the man who'd tried to take her. His brother couldn't be more than 18, all gangly limbs and misplaced bravado. Your brother drew first, Jake said evenly. Asked him to ride on. He made his choice. Don't matter. Family's family. The boy's gun steadied slightly. You gotta pay. Not here, Jake said firmly. Not in front of my wife. You want to do this, we do it proper. Tomorrow, noon, outside town. Fair fight. The boy considered, then shook his head. No, now, here, just like you did Tom. Time slowed. Sarah saw Jake's hand move, impossibly fast, saw the boy's eyes widen in surprise. 2 shots cracked almost as one, echoing off the buildings. Jake staggered, hand going to his side where red was already spreading. The boy crumpled, his gun clattering across the boardwalk. Jake! Sarah caught him as he swayed, her hands immediately going to the wound. No, no, no! It's not bad, he said through gritted teeth. Caught the edge. I'll be fine. People were gathering, Sheriff Watson pushing through the crowd. He took in the scene with professional efficiency. The dead boy. Jake's wound. Sarah's white face. Self-defense, someone called out. Boy drew first. We all saw it. Watson knelt by the body, closing the boy's eyes. Danny McGraw. Should have known he'd try something stupid. He looked up at Jake. You need the doctor. I need to get my wife somewhere safe. Jake countered, but his face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. The doctor, Sarah said firmly. Now! They half-carried Jake to Dr. Pritchard's office. Sarah's wedding dress now stained with blood. The doctor, a competent man with steady hands, cleaned and bandaged the wound. You're lucky, he pronounced. Inch to the left and we'd be having a different conversation. You'll be sore for a while, but you'll heal. Can he travel? Sarah asked. Not for a few days. That wound needs time to close properly. Jake cursed under his breath. Can't stay here. McGraw had friends. You'll stay, Watson said from the doorway. Anyone wants to try something. They'll have to go through me. Dalton's not the only one who remembers what he owes you. They returned to the hotel. Jake leaning heavily on Sarah. Once in their room. She helped him into bed, hands shaking with delayed reaction. Some wedding night, Jake said wryly. You're alive. That's all that matters. Sarah curled beside him carefully, mindful of his wound. Is it always going to be like this? Someone remembering, someone seeking revenge? I don't know, Jake answered honestly. Maybe, does it change things? Sarah thought about it, about the constant vigilance, the threat of violence, the past that wouldn't stay buried. Then she thought about the alternative, a safe, predictable life with a man she didn't love. No, she said firmly. It changes nothing. I'd rather have uncertainty with you than safety with anyone else. You say that now? I'll say it tomorrow, too, and the day after that. She raised up to look at him. I knew what I was choosing. Jake, I chose it anyway. Choose it still. He pulled her down for a kiss, gentle and grateful. I don't deserve you. Probably not, she agreed, making him laugh, then wince. But you're stuck with me now, for better or worse. Remember. I remember,
His eyes grew heavy, the day's events and blood loss taking their toll. "Love you, Sarah Thornton."
"Love you too," she whispered, but he was already asleep.
5 years had passed since that bloody night in Cedar Ridge. 5 years since Sarah Morrison became Sarah Thornton. Since a hired gun and an Eastern lady decided to build something together against all odds. The ranch house wasn't grand, nothing like Coleman Dalton's empire, but it was theirs. Built with their own hands, board by board, stone by stone. It sat in a valley 20 miles north of Cedar Ridge, sheltered by cottonwoods, blessed with good water and grass that stayed green even in drought years. Sarah stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. At 4 months pregnant with their second child, she moved carefully, one hand resting on her growing belly. Inside, she could hear Jake's voice, low and patient, reading to their daughter. "Mama, look!" 3-year-old Elizabeth burst through the door, clutching a wooden horse Jake had carved. "Papa made it fly." Did he now? Sarah caught her daughter, marveling as always at this miracle, Jake's dark eyes in her face, Sarah's stubborn chin already showing. Jake followed, moving with the slight stiffness that cold weather brought to old wounds. The scar from Danny McGraw's bullet was just one of many now, each a reminder of the life they'd left behind. "Getting too big to fly much longer, little bird," he said, but his smile was soft as he watched them together. "Story's not finished," Elizabeth protested. "The princess hasn't saved the cowboy yet." "Saved him?" Sarah raised an eyebrow at her husband. "That's not how I remember the story going." "I might have changed it some," Jake admitted. "Seemed more honest this way." They returned inside, Elizabeth scampering ahead to reclaim her spot by the fire. The house was simple but warm rag rugs Sarah had made, furniture Jake had built, walls decorated with Elizabeth's drawings and the few treasures they'd accumulated. After Elizabeth was asleep, they sat together on the porch, Jake's arm around Sarah's shoulders, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Regrets?" Jake asked. "Their old ritual?" "Never," Sarah answered, their traditional response. "You?" "Only that I didn't find you sooner." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Could have had more years of this." "We have the years we have," Sarah said philosophically. "It's enough." A rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast. Jake tensed, hand moving to the rifle that was never far away. Old habits died hard, even after 5 years of relative peace. But as the rider drew closer, Sarah recognized him, Tom Santos, who'd ridden with Jake against Hendricks all those years ago. He pulled up at their gate, grinning widely. "Jake misses. Thornton got news from town." "Good or bad?" Jake asked warily. "Depends on how you look at it. Coleman Dalton's getting married." Sarah felt surprise ripple through her. After their departure, they'd heard little from that quarter. Only occasional news through the frontier grapevine. "Who's the unlucky woman?" Jake asked. "Widow from San Antonio. Has 2 boys already. Seems to know her own mind. Word is she's got Dalton wrapped around her finger good and proper." Sarah smiled, genuinely pleased. "Good for him. He deserves happiness." "There's more," Santos continued. "He's sent word, wants to see you both. Says there's something needs settling." Jake's expression darkened. After 5 years, what could he want now? "Only one way to find out," Santos shrugged. "Though if you ask me, doesn't seem like trouble. Message said to bring the family." They debated through the night. The past was the past, but Coleman Dalton had given them their future. They owed him the courtesy of hearing him out. 3 days later, they rode into Dalton's ranch, Elizabeth secure in front of Jake, Sarah managing despite her pregnancy. The place looked different, softer somehow, with flower gardens and children's toys scattered about. Dalton met them at the door, and Sarah barely recognized him. Gone was the stern businessman. In his place stood a man who looked content, happy, even.
Jake! Sarah!
His smile was genuine. You came. Coleman. Jake dismounted, helping Sarah and Elizabeth down. You look well. Love does that to a man. Dalton's eyes went to Elizabeth, softening. And this must be...
Elizabeth, Sarah supplied. Elizabeth, this is Mr. Dalton, an old friend.
The girl studied him with Jake's intense gaze.
Are you the man who let Mama go?
Dalton laughed, surprised.
What have you been telling her?
The truth, Jake said simply. Seemed best.
Indeed.
Yes, little one.
I'm the man who was smart enough to let your mama choose her own path.
He gestured to the house.
Come, Maria's eager to meet you.
Maria Dalton proved to be a warm, practical woman who immediately took charge of Elizabeth, whisking her off to meet her own boys and see the new puppies in the barn. That left the adults alone, the past hanging between them like smoke. Why now? Coleman, Jake asked directly. Why summon us after all this time? Dalton poured whiskey for the men, tea for Sarah.
Because I'm dying.
The words fell like stones in still water. Sarah's cup rattled as she set it down.
How long?
Jake's voice was steady, but Sarah saw his knuckles whiten. 6 months, maybe less. Doc says there's something growing inside that shouldn't be there. Dalton shrugged. I've made my peace with it. Maria knows. She's strong. But there's something I need to do first. He retrieved a leather portfolio from his desk. I've been keeping track of you both. Don't look like that. Jake not spying, just making sure you were well. I know about the hard years at first, the struggle to get the ranch started. We managed, Jake said stiffly. You did, but it should have been easier. Dalton opened the portfolio. The money I paid Sarah's father, that was conscience money, helping an old friend, but I profited from his desperation, from Sarah's sacrifice. That debt's been weighing on me.
There's no debt, Sarah protested. You gave us our freedom.
I gave you what should never have been mine to give. Dalton pushed the papers across. This makes it right. Deed to 1,000 acres adjoining your land. Good water rights, and enough capital to stock it properly. Call it a belated wedding gift. Jake stood abruptly.
We don't want your charity.
It's not charity. Dalton's voice was firm. It's justice. I bought Sarah like property. Jake, yes, I let her go, but only after I'd already wronged her. This doesn't make it right, but it helps balance the scales.
Coleman, Sarah said gently. You don't owe us anything. You gave us everything when you let us go.
Did I, or did I just stop taking what wasn't mine? Dalton smiled sadly. I've learned a lot about love these past years with Maria. Real love, not ownership. Made me see things differently. Elizabeth's laughter drifted from outside, mixing with the barking of puppies and the shouts of boys, the sound of children, of life continuing despite everything. Take it, Dalton said quietly. For her. For the one coming. Let me do this one thing right. Jake looked at Sarah, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, he nodded. Not for us. For them. Good enough. Dalton raised his glass. To the future, then, to children who'll grow up free to choose their own paths. They stayed for dinner, an oddly comfortable gathering of tangled pasts and redirected futures. Maria proved perfect for Dalton, strong enough to stand up to him, warm enough to soften his edges. She and Sarah found easy conversation while Jake and Dalton discussed cattle prices and water rights like the old associates they were. She's good for him, Sarah said as they prepared to leave. He's good for me too, Maria replied.
Oh, I know his past, know about you, but the man he is now.
The man you're leaving helped him become. That's the one I fell in love with. The ride home was quiet. Elizabeth asleep against Jake's chest. The future suddenly broader with Coleman's gift. He's right, you know, Sarah said eventually. about making things right. Maybe. Jake's voice was thoughtful. Or maybe things worked out the way they were supposed to, without those 3 days on the trail, without the choices we made. We wouldn't have this, Sarah finished. I know, but I'm glad he found peace. Glad he found love. Real love this time. Jake agreed. Not something bought and paid for. They reached their ranch as the moon rose, the familiar building silver in its light. Jake helped Sarah down, his hands lingering on her waist. Home, he said simply. Home, she agreed. Later, after Elizabeth was tucked in and the house was quiet, they stood together looking out at their land, theirs through work and struggle, soon to be expanded by an old debt finally paid. Think she'll remember today? Sarah asked. Meeting Coleman. Probably not the details, but maybe the feeling of it, that people can choose kindness, choose to make things right. Is that the lesson? Jake turned her to face him, hands gentle on her shoulders. The lesson is that love can't be bought or sold, only chosen. That freedom matters more than security, that sometimes the longest road leads to the right destination. And that cowboys sometimes need saving just as much as princesses, Sarah added, thinking of Elizabeth's revised story. That too. Jake smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. Especially that. 6 months later, word came that Coleman Dalton had died peacefully, surrounded by family. They attended the funeral, Jake serving as a pallbearer alongside men who'd once looked down on him as just hired help. Sarah held their newborn son, Coleman Jacob Thornton, named for 2 men who'd shaped their path in very different ways. Maria, dressed in widow's weeds but standing strong, pressed Sarah's hand at the graveside. He was happy at the end, said he'd finally learned the difference between holding and having. Said you taught him that. Sarah looked across at Jake, their eyes meeting over the crowd. They'd taught each other, all of them, in their stumbling way, about choice and freedom, about love and letting go, about the courage it took to build something real in a hard land. The preacher spoke words about dust and destiny, about paths chosen and choices made. Sarah barely heard him, too caught up in memory, a dusty trail, a man who wouldn't take what wasn't freely given, a choice made under desert stars that changed everything. Elizabeth tugged at her skirt. Mama, why are you crying? Happy tears, sweetheart. Sometimes we cry when we're grateful. Grateful for what? Sarah looked at her family. Jake standing strong despite old wounds. Elizabeth with her father's eyes and her mother's spirit. Baby Coleman sleeping peacefully in her arms. Beyond them, their ranch waited, expanded now, thriving. For second chances, she said softly. For men brave enough to give them and women brave enough to take them. The service ended, mourners dispersing to their lives and concerns. But Jake and Sarah lingered, paying respects to a man who'd unknowingly given them everything by letting go. Ready? Jake asked finally. Ready, Sarah confirmed. They walked back to their wagon together, their children between them, their future stretching ahead like an open trail. Behind them, Coleman Dalton rested beneath the Texas earth, his debts paid, his conscience clear. And somewhere above, the first stars were beginning to appear, constant as promises, bright as hope. Jake pointed them out to Elizabeth as they rode, teaching her their names and stories just as he'd once taught her mother. That one's special, he said, indicating a particularly bright star. Know why? Why, Papa? Because it always leads you home. No matter how far you travel, how lost you get, that star will guide you back to where you belong. Elizabeth nodded solemnly, filing away this crucial information. Sarah smiled, remembering another night, another lesson about stars. How far they'd come from that first campfire, that first careful distance. Mama, Elizabeth asked sleepily. Tell me the story again about the princess who saved the cowboy. Tomorrow, little bird, Sarah promised. "Tonight, just rest." But as they rode through the gathering darkness toward home, Sarah found herself telling the story anyway, not of princesses and cowboys, but of real people making hard choices, of a woman sold to pay debts, a man hired to deliver her, and the love that bloomed despite every obstacle. "And they lived happily ever after?" Elizabeth asked. The eternal question. Sarah looked at Jake, at their children, at the life they'd built from nothing but determination and love. "They lived," she said simply, "together, and that was happiness enough." The wagon rolled on through the desert night, carrying them home, above. The stars Jake had named watched their passage, eternal witnesses to the choices that shaped lives, the chances that changed destinies, and the love that made it all worthwhile. In the end, that's all any of us can ask for: the freedom to choose, the courage to love, and the grace to accept both the trials and triumphs that follow. Sarah Morrison had left Boston looking for security and found something infinitely more precious: a life truly lived, a love truly chosen, and a future truly earned. The desert wind carried the sound of their wagon wheels, and somewhere in that vast darkness, their ranch waited: lamp in the window, fire in the hearth, home in the deepest sense of the word. They were no longer running, they had arrived. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope you enjoyed following Sarah and Jake's journey from that first dusty trail to their hard-won happiness. If you're listening to this story, I'd love to know where you are right now. Please share in the comments below where in the world you're experiencing this tale of frontier romance. Your thoughts and feelings about their story mean everything to me. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to Wild West Stories 1850 and hitting that like button. And if you really want to help more people discover these authentic tales of love and courage in the American frontier, please hit the hype button to boost this video. Until next time, partners, keep riding toward your own sunset.